Chapter 30 of The Seven Secrets by William LeQueux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 30. Sir Bernard's Decision. For fully a week I saw nothing of Ambler. Sir Bernard was unwell, and remained down at Hove, therefore I was compelled to attend to his practice. There were several serious cases, the patients being persons of note, thus I was kept very busy. My friend's silence was puzzling. I wrote to him, but received no response. A wire to his office in the City elicited the fact that Mr. Jevons was out of town. Probably he was still pursuing the inquiry he had so actively taken up. Nevertheless, I was dissatisfied that he should leave me so entirely in the dark as to his intentions and discoveries. Ethelwynn came to town for the day, and I spent several hours shopping with her. She was strangely nervous, and all the old spontaneous gaiety seemed to have left her. She had read in the papers of the curious connection between the death of the man Lane and that of her unfortunate sister, therefore our conversation was mainly upon the river mystery. Sometimes she seemed ill at ease with me, as though fearing some discovery. Perhaps, however, it was merely my fancy. I loved her. She was all the world to me, and yet in her eyes I seemed to read some hidden secret which she was endeavouring, with all the power at her command, to conceal. In such circumstances there was bound to arise between us a certain reserve that we had not before known. Her conversation was carried on in a mechanical manner, as though distracted by her inner thoughts, and when, after having tea together in Bond Street, we drove to the station, and I saw her off on her return to Neneford, my mind was full of darkest apprehensions. Yes, that interview convinced me more than ever that she was in some manner cognizant of the truth. The secret existence of old Mr. Courtenay, the man who I myself had pronounced dead, was the crowning point of the strange affair. And yet I felt by some inward intuition that this fact was not unknown to her. All the remarkable events of that moonlit night when I had followed husband and wife along the river bank came back to me, and I saw vividly the old man's face, haggard and drawn, just as it had been in life. Surely there could be no stranger current of events than those which formed the Seven Secrets. They were beyond explanation, all of them. I knew nothing. I had certainly seen results, but I knew not their cause. Nitrate of amyl was not a drug which a costermonger would select with a view to committing suicide. Indeed, I dare say few of my readers, unless they are doctors or chemists, have ever before heard of it. Therefore my own conclusion, fully endorsed by the erratic Ambler, was that the poor fellow had been secretly poisoned. Nearly a fortnight passed, and I heard nothing of Ambler. He was still out of town. Day by day passed, but nothing of note transpired. Sir Bernard was still suffering from a slight touch of sciatica at home, and on visiting him one Sunday I found him confined to his bed, grumbling and peevish. He was eccentric in his miserly habits and his hatred of society, beyond doubt, and the absurdities which his enemies attributed to him were not altogether unfounded. But he had, at all events, the rare quality of entertaining for his profession a respect nearly akin to enthusiasm. Indeed, according to his views, the faculty possessed almost infallible qualities. In confidence he had more than once admitted to me that certain of his colleagues practising in Harley Street were amazing donkeys, but he would never have allowed anyone else to say so. From the moment a man acquired that diploma which gave him the right over life and death, that man became, in his eyes, an august personage for the world at large. It was a crime, he thought, for a patient not to submit to his decision, and certainly it must be admitted that his success in the treatment of nervous disorders had been most remarkable. "You were at that lecture by Deboutin of Paris the other day?" he exclaimed to me suddenly, while I was seated at his bedside describing the work I had been doing for him in London. "Why didn't you tell me you were going there?" "I went quite unexpectedly with a friend." "With whom?" "Ambler Jevons." "Oh, that detective fellow," laughed the old physician. "Well," he added, "it was all very interesting, wasn't it?" "Very, especially your own demonstrations. I had no idea that you were in correspondence with Deboutin." He laughed, then with a knowing look said: "Ah, my dear fellow, nowadays it doesn't do to tell anyone of your own researches. The only way is to spring it upon the profession as a great triumph, just as Koch did his cure for tuberculosis. One must create an impression, if only with a quack remedy. The day of the steady plodder is past. It's all hustle, even in medicine." "Well, you certainly did make an impression," I said, smiling. "Your experiments were a revelation to the profession. They were talking of them at the hospital only yesterday." They thought me an old fogey, eh? But, you see, I've been keeping pace with the times, Boyd. A man to succeed nowadays must make a boom with something, it matters not what. For years I've been experimenting in secret, and some day I will show them further results of my researches, and they will come upon the profession like a thunderclap staggering belief." The old man chuckled to himself as he thought of his scientific triumph, and how one day he would give forth to the world a truth hitherto unsuspected. We chatted for a long time, mostly upon technicalities which cannot interest the reader, until suddenly he said: "I'm getting old, Boyd. These constant attacks I have render me unfit to go to town and sit in judgment on that pack of silly women who rush to consult me whenever they have a headache or an erring husband. I think that very soon I ought to retire. I've done sufficient hard work all the years since I was a locum down in Oxfordshire. I'm worn out." "Oh no," I said, "you mustn't retire yet. If you did, the profession would lose one of its most brilliant men." "Enough of compliments," he snapped, turning wearily on his pillow. "I'm sick to death of it all. Better to retire while I have fame than to outlive it. When I give up you will step into my shoes, Boyd, and it will be a good thing for you." Such a suggestion was quite unexpected. I had never dreamed that he contemplated handing over his practice to me. Certainly it would be a good thing for me if he did. It would give me a chance such as few men ever had. True, I was well known to his patients and had worked hard in his interest, but that he intended to hand his practice over to me I had never contemplated. Hence I thanked him most heartily. Yes, Sir Bernard had been my benefactor always. "All the women know you," he went on in his snappish way. "You are the only man to take my place. They would come to you, but not to a new man. All I can hope is that they won't bore you with their domestic troubles, as they have done me," and he smiled. "Oh," I said, "more than once I too have been compelled to listen to the domestic secrets of certain households. It really is astounding what a woman will tell her doctor, even though he may be young." The old man laughed again. "Ah!" he sighed. "You don't know women as I know them, Boyd. You've got your experience to gain. Then you'll hold them in abhorrence, just as I do. They call me a woman hater," he grunted. "Perhaps I am, for I've had cause to hold the feminine mind and the feminine passion equally in contempt." "Well," I laughed, "there's not a man in London who is more qualified to speak from personal experience than yourself. So I anticipate a pretty rough time when I've had years of it, as you have." "And yet you want to marry," he snapped, looking me straight in the face. "Of course you love Ethelwynn Mivart. Every man at your age loves. It is a malady that occurs in the teens and declines in the 30s. I should have thought that your affection of the heart had been about cured. It is surely time it was." "It is true that I love Ethelwynn," I declared, rather annoyed, "and I intend to marry her." "If you do, then you'll spoil all your chances of success. The class of women who are my patients would much rather consult a confirmed bachelor than a man who has a jealous wife hanging to his coat tails. The doctor's wife must always be a long suffering person." I smiled, and then our conversation turned upon his proposed retirement, which was to take place in 6 months' time. I returned to London by the last train, and on entering my room found a telegram from Ambler making an appointment to call on the following evening. The message was dated from Eastbourne, and was the first I had received from him for some days. Next morning I sat in Sir Bernard's consulting room as usual, receiving patients, and the afternoon I spent on the usual hospital round. About 6 o'clock Ambler arrived, drank a brandy and soda with a reflective air, and then suggested that we might dine together at the Cavour, a favourite haunt of his. At table I endeavoured to induce him to explain his movements and what he had discovered. But he was still disinclined to tell me anything. He worked always in secret, and until facts were clear, said nothing. It was a peculiarity of his to remain dumb, even to his most intimate friends concerning any inquiries he was making. He was a man of moods, with an active mind and a still tongue, two qualities essential to the successful unravelling of mysteries. Having finished dinner we lit cigars, and took a cab back to my rooms. On passing along Harley Street it suddenly occurred to me that in the morning I had left a case of instruments in Sir Bernard's consulting room, and that I might require them for one of my patients if called that night. Therefore I stopped the cab, dismissed it, and knocked at Sir Bernard's door. Ford, on opening it, surprised me by announcing that his master, whom I had left in bed on the previous night, had returned to town suddenly, but was engaged. Ambler waited in the hall, while I passed along to the door of the consulting room, with the intention of asking permission to enter, as I always did when Sir Bernard was engaged with a patient. On approaching the door, however, I was startled by hearing a woman's voice raised in angry, reproachful words, followed immediately by the sound of a scuffle, and then a stifled cry. Without further hesitation I turned the handle. The door was locked. Chapter 30. Recording by Tom Weiss. Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 31 of the 7 Secrets by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 31 contains the plain truth. A sudden idea occurred to me, and I acted instantly upon its impulse. There was a second entrance through the morning room, and I dashed round to the other door, which fortunately yielded. The sight that met my gaze was absolutely staggering. I stood upon the threshold aghast. Sir Bernard, his dark eyes starting from his ashen face, stood holding a woman within his grasp, pinning her to the wall, and struggling to cover her mouth with his hands and prevent her cries from being overheard. The woman was none other than Ethelwynn. At my unexpected entry he released his hold, shrinking back with a wild, fierce look in his face, such as I had never before seen. "Ralph!" cried my love, rushing forward and clinging to my neck. "Ralph, for God's sake, save me from that fiend! Save me!" I put my arm around her to protect her, at the same instant shouting to Jevons, who had entered, as much astounded as myself. My love had evidently come to town and kept an appointment with the old man. The situation was startling and required explanation. "Tell me, Ethelwynn," I said in a hard, stern voice. "What does all this mean?" She drew herself up and tried to face me firmly, but was unable. I had burst in upon her unexpectedly, and she seemed to fear how much of the conversation I had overheard. Noticing her silence, my friend Jevons addressed her, saying: "Miss Mivart, you are aware of all the circumstances of the tragedy at Kew. Please explain them. Only by frank admission can you clear yourself, remember. To prevaricate further is quite useless." She glanced at the cringing old fellow standing on the further side of the room, the man who had raised his hand against her. Then with a sudden resolution she spoke, saying: "It is true that I am aware of many facts which have been until to day kept secret. But now that I know the horrible truth they shall remain mysteries no longer. I have been the victim of a long and dastardly persecution, but I now hope to clear my honour before you, Ralph, and before my Creator." Then she paused, and taking breath, and drawing herself straight up with an air of determined resolution, went on: "First, let us go back to the days soon after Mary's marriage. I think it was about a year after the wedding when I suddenly noticed a change in her. Her intellect seemed somehow weakened. Hitherto she had possessed a strong, well defined character. This suddenly developed into a weak, almost childish balance of the brain.
Instead of possessing a will of her own, she was no longer the mistress of her own actions, but as easily led as an infant. Only to myself and my mother was this change apparent. To all her friends and acquaintances she was just the same. About that time she consulted this man here, Sir Bernard Eyton, her husband's friend, regarding some other ailment, and he no doubt at once detected that her intellect had given way. Although devoted to her husband, nevertheless the influence of any friend of the moment was irresistible, and for that reason she drifted into the pleasure-seeking set in town." "But the tragedy!" Jevons exclaimed. "Tell us of that. My own inquiries show that you are aware of it all. Mrs. Courtenay murdered her husband, I know." "Mary the assassin!" I gasped. "Alas! It is too true. Now that my poor sister is dead, concealment is no longer necessary," my love responded with a deep sigh. "Mary killed her husband. She returned home, entered the house secretly, and ascending to his room, struck him to the heart." "But the wound how was it inflicted?" I demanded eagerly. "With that pair of long, sharp-pointed scissors which used to be on poor Henry's writing table. You remember them? They were about 8 inches long, with ivory handles and a red morocco case. The wound puzzled you, but to me it seems plain that, after striking the blow, it was an endeavour to extricate the weapon. She opened it and closed it again, therefore inflicting those internal injuries that were so minutely described at the inquest. Well, on that night I heard a sound, and fearing that the invalid wanted something, crept from my room. As I gained the door I met Mary upon the threshold. She stood facing me, with a weird, fixed look, and in her hand was the weapon with which she had killed her husband. That awful moment is fixed indelibly upon my memory. I shall carry its recollection to the grave. I dashed quickly into the room, and to my horror saw what had occurred. Then my thoughts were for Mary, to conceal her guilt. Whispering to her to obey me, I led her downstairs, through the back premises, and so out into the street. A cab was passing, and I put her into it, telling the man to drive to the Hennikers, with whom she had been spending the evening. Then, cleaning the scissors of blood by thrusting them several times into the mould of a garden I was passing, I crossed the road and tossed them over the high wall into the thick undergrowth which flanks Kew Gardens. At that spot I felt certain that they would never be discovered. As quickly as possible I re-entered the house, secured the door by which I had made my exit, and returned again to my room with the awful knowledge of my sister's crime upon my conscience." "What hour was that?" "When I returned again to bed, my watch showed that it was barely 1:30. At 2 o'clock Short, awakened by his alarm clock, made the discovery and aroused the house. What followed you know well enough. I need not describe it. You can imagine what I felt, and how guilty was my conscience with the awful knowledge of it all." "The circumstances were certainly most puzzling," I remarked. "It almost appears as though matters were cleverly arranged in order to baffle detection." "To a certain extent they undoubtedly were. I knew that the Hennikers would say nothing of poor Mary's erratic return to them. I did all in my power to withdraw suspicion from my sister, at the risk of it falling upon myself. You suspected me, Ralph, and only naturally, after that letter you discovered." "But Mary's homicidal tendency seems to have been carefully concealed," I said. "I recollect having detected in her a strange vagueness of manner, but it never occurred to me that she was mentally weak. In the days immediately preceding the tragedy I certainly saw but little of her. She was out nearly every evening." "She was not responsible for her actions for several weeks together sometimes," Sir Bernard interrupted. "I discovered it over a year ago." "And you profited by your discovery!" my love cried, turning upon him fiercely. "The crime was committed at your instigation," she declared. "At my instigation!" he echoed with a dry laugh. "I suppose you will say next that I hypnotized her, or some bunkum of that sort." "I'm no believer in hypnotic theories. They were exploded long ago," she answered. "But what I do believe, nay, what is positively proved from my poor sister's own lips by a statement made before witnesses, is that you were the instigator of the crime. You met her by appointment that night at Kew Bridge, you opened the door of the house for her, and you compelled her to go in and commit the deed. Although demented, she recollected it all in her saner moments. You told her terrible stories of old Mr. Courtenay, for whom you had feigned such friendship, and for weeks you urged her to kill him secretly, until, in the frenzy of insanity to which you had brought her, she carried out your design with all that careful ingenuity that is so often characteristic of madness." "You lie, woman!" the old man snapped. "I had nothing whatever to do with the affair. I was at home at Hove on that night." "No, you were not," interrupted Jevons. "Your memory requires refreshing. Reflect a moment, and you'll find that you arrived at Brighton Station at 7 o'clock next morning from Victoria. You spent the night in London, and further, you were recognized by a police inspector walking along the Chiswick Road as early as 3:30. I have not been idle, Sir Bernard, and have spent a good deal of time at Hove of late." "What do you allege, then?" he cried in fierce anger, a dark, evil expression on his pale, drawn face. "I suppose you'll declare that I'm a murderer next?" "I allege that, at your instigation, a serious and desperate attempt was made, a short time ago, upon the life of my friend Boyd by ruffians who were well paid by you." "Another lie!" he blurted forth defiantly. "What?" I cried. "Is that the truth, Ambler? Was I entrapped at the instigation of this man?" "Yes. He had reasons for getting rid of you, as you will discern later." "I tell you it's an untruth!" shouted the old man in a frenzy of rage. "Deny it if you will," answered my friend with a nonchalant air. "It, however, may be interesting to you to know that the man Lanky Lane, one of the desperate gang whom you bribed to call up Boyd on the night in question, is what is known at Scotland Yard as a policeman's nose, or informer, and that he made a plain statement of the whole affair before he fell a victim to your carefully laid plan by which his lips were sealed." In an instant I recollected that the costermonger of the London Road was one of the ruffians. The old man's lips compressed. He saw that he was cornered. The revelation that to his clever cunning was due the many remarkable features of the mystery held me utterly bewildered. At first it seemed impossible. But as the discussion grew more heated, and the facts poured forth from the mouth of the woman I loved, and from the man who was my best friend, I became convinced that at last the whole of the mysterious affair would be elucidated. One point, however, still puzzled me, namely, the inexplicable scene I had witnessed on the bank of the Nene. I referred to it, whereupon Ambler Jevons drew from his breast pocket 2 photographs, and holding them before the eyes of the trembling old man, said: "You recognize these? For a long time past I've been making inquiries into your keen interest in amateur theatricals. My information led me to Curtis's, the wig makers, and they furnished me with this picture, showing you made up as Henry Courtenay. It seems that, under the name of Slade, you furnished them with a portrait of the dead man, and ordered the disguise to be copied exactly, a fact to which a dozen witnesses are prepared to swear. This caused me to wonder what game you were playing, and after watching I found that on certain nights you wore the disguise, a most complete and excellent one, and with it imposed upon the unfortunate widow of weak intellect. You posed as her husband, and she believed you to be him. So completely was the woman in your thrall that you actually led her to believe that Courtenay was not dead after all. You had a deeper game to play. It was a clever and daring piece of imposture. Representing yourself as her husband who, for financial reasons, had been compelled to disappear and was believed to be dead, you had formed a plan whereby to obtain the widow's fortune as soon as the executors had given her complete mastery of it. You had arranged it all with her. She was to pose as a widow, mourn your loss, and then sell the Devonshire estate and hand you the money, believing you to be her husband and rightly entitled to it. The terrible crime which the unfortunate woman had committed at your instigation had turned her brain, as you anticipated, and she, docile and half-witted, was entirely beneath your influence until—" and he paused. "Until what?" I asked, utterly astounded at this remarkable explanation of what I had considered to be an absolutely inexplicable phenomenon. He spoke again, quite calmly. until this man, to his dismay, found that poor Mrs. Courtenay's intellect was regaining its strength. They met beside the river, and her brain suddenly regaining its balance, she discovered the ingenious fraud he was imposing upon her. Turning to Sir Bernard, he said: "She tore off your disguise, and declared that she would go to the police and tell the truth of the whole circumstances, how that you had induced her to go to the house in Kew and kill her husband. You saw that your game was up if she were not silenced, therefore, without further ado, you sent the poor woman to her last account." "You lie!" the old man cried, his drawn face blanched to the lips. "She fell in accidentally." "She did not. You threw her in," declared Ambler Jevons firmly. "I followed you there. I was witness of the scene between you, and although too far off to save poor Mrs. Courtenay, I was witness of your crime." "You!" he gasped, glaring at my companion in fear, as though he foresaw the horror of his punishment. "Yes," responded Jevons, in his dry, matter-of-fact voice, his sleepy eyes brightening for a moment. "Since the day of the tragedy at Kew, until this afternoon, I have never relinquished the inquiry. The 7 secrets I took one by one, and gradually penetrated them, at the same time keeping always near you, and watching your movements when you least expected it. But enough, I never reveal my methods. Suffice it to say that in this I have succeeded by sheer patience and application. Every word of my allegation I am prepared to substantiate in due course at the Old Bailey." Then, after a second's pause, he looked straight at the culprit standing there, crushed and dumb before him, and declared: "Sir Bernard Eyton, you are a murderer." With my love's hand held in mine, I stood speechless at those staggering revelations. I saw how Ethelwynn watched the contortions of the old doctor's face with secret satisfaction, for he had ever been her enemy, just as he had been mine. He had uttered those libellous hints regarding her with a view to parting us, so as to give him greater freedom to work his will with poor Mary. Then, when he had feared that through my love I had obtained knowledge of his dastardly offence, he had made an attempt upon my life by means of hired ruffians. The woman who had been in his drawing room at Hove on the occasion of my visit was Mary, as I afterwards found out, and the attractive young person in the Brighton train had also been a caller at his house in connection with the attempt planned to be made upon me. "You intend to arrest me?" Sir Bernard gasped at last, with some difficulty, his brow like ivory beneath the tight drawn skin. A change had come over him, and he was standing with his back to the bookcase, swaying unsteadily as though he must fall. "I certainly do," was Ambler Jevons' prompt response. "You have been the means of committing a double murder for the purposes of gain, because you knew that your friend Courtenay had left a will in your favour in the event of his wife's decease. That will has already been proved, but perhaps it may interest you to know that the latest, and therefore the valid will, is in my own possession, I having found it during a search of the dead man's effects in company with my friend Boyd. It is dated only a month before his death, and leaves the fortune to the widow, and in the event of her death, to her sister Ethelwynn." "To me?" cried my love in surprise. "Yes, Miss Ethelwynn. Everything is left to you unreservedly," he explained. Then, turning again to the clever impostor before him, he added: "You will therefore recognize that all your plotting, so well matured and so carefully planned that your demoniacal ingenuity almost surpasses the comprehension of man, has been in vain. By the neglect of one small detail, namely, to sufficiently disguise your identity when dealing with Curtis, I have been enabled, after a long and tedious search, to fix you as the man who on several occasions was made up to present in the night the appearance of the dead Courtenay. The work has taken me many tedious weeks. I visited every wig maker and half the hairdressers in London unsuccessfully until, by mere chance, the ruffian whom you employed to entrap my friend Boyd gave me a clue to the fact that Curtis made wigs as well as theatrical costumes. The inquiry has been a long and hazardous one," he went on.
but from the very first I was determined to get at the bottom of the mystery, cost me what it might, and I have fortunately succeeded." Then, turning again to the cringing wretch, upon whom the terrible denunciation had fallen as a thunderbolt, he added: "The forgiveness of man, Sir Bernard Eyton, you will never obtain. It has been ever law that the murderer shall die, and you will be no exception." The effect of those words upon the guilty man was almost electrical. He drew himself up stiffly, his keen, wild eyes starting from his blanched face as he glared at his accuser. His lips moved. No sound, however, came from them. The muscles of his jaws seemed to suddenly become paralyzed, for he was unable to close his mouth. He stood for a moment, an awful spectacle, the brand of Cain upon him. A strange gurgling sound escaped him, as though he were trying to articulate, but was unable. Then he made wild signs with both his hands, clutched suddenly at the air, and fell forward in a fit. I went to him, loosened his collar, and applied restoratives, but in 10 minutes I saw that he was beyond human aid. What I had at first believed to be a fit was a sudden cessation of the functions of the heart, caused by wild excitement and the knowledge that punishment was upon him. Within 15 minutes of that final accusation, the old man lay back upon the carpet lifeless, struck dead by natural causes at the moment that his crimes had become revealed. Thus were the 7 secrets explained, and thus were the Central Criminal Court and the public spared what would have been one of the most sensational trials of modern times. The papers on Monday reported, with deepest regret, the sudden death from heart disease of Sir Bernard Eyton, whom they termed one of the greatest and most skilful physicians of modern times. Just 2 years have passed since that memorable evening. You, my reader, are probably curious to know whether I have succeeded in obtaining the quiet country practice that was my ideal. Well, yes, I have. And what is more, I have obtained in Ethelwynn a wife who is devoted to me and beloved by all the countryside. A wife who is the very perfection of all that is noble and good in woman. The Courtenay estate is ours, but I am not an idle man. Somehow I cannot be. My practice, where is it? Well, it is in Leicestershire. I dare not be more explicit, for Ethelwynn has urged me to conceal our identity, in order that we may not be remarked as a couple whose wooing was so strangely tragic and romantic. Ambler Jevons still carries on his tea blending business in the city, the most confirmed of bachelors, and the shrewdest of all criminal investigators. Even though we have been so intimate for years, and he often visits me at I was nearly by a slip writing the name of the Leicestershire village, he has never explained to me his methods, and seldom, if ever, speaks of those wonderful successes by which Scotland Yard is so frequently glad to profit. Only a few days ago, while we were sitting on the lawn behind my quaint old-fashioned house awaiting dinner, I chanced to remark upon the happiness which his ingenuity and perseverance had brought me. Whereupon, turning to me with a slight reflective smile, he replied: "Ah, yes, Ralph, old fellow, I gave up that problem in despair fully a dozen times, and it was only because I knew that the future happiness of you both depended upon its satisfactory solution that I began afresh and strove on, determined not to be beaten. I watched carefully, not only Eyton, but Ethelwynn and yourself. I was often near you when you least suspected my presence. But that crafty old scoundrel was possessed of the ingenuity of Satan himself, combined with all the shrewd qualities that go to make a good detective. Hence, in every movement, every wile, and every action he was careful to cover himself, so that he could establish an alibi on every point. For that reason the work was extremely difficult. He was a veritable artist in crime. Yes," he added, "of the many inquiries I've taken up, the most curious and most complicated of them all was that of the 7 secrets." This is the end of the 7 Secrets by William le Queux. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.